No tears in heaven, no sorrows given, all will be glory in that land. There'll be no sadness, all will be gladness, when we shall join that happy band. No tears in heaven fares, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fares, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known. Glory is waiting, waiting up yonder, where we shall spend an endless day. There with our Savior we'll be forever, when no more sorrow can dismay. No tears in heaven fares, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fares, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known. Some morning yonder we'll cease to ponder o'er things this life has brought to view. All will be clearer, loved ones be dearer, in heaven where all will be made new. No tears in heaven fares, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fares, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known.
I feel the touch of hands so kind and tender. They're leading me in paths that I must trod. I have no fear when Jesus walks beside me, for I'm sheltered in the arms of God.
Soon I shall hear the call from heaven's portals. Come home, my child, it's the last mile you must trod. I'll fall asleep and wake in God's new heaven, sheltered safe within the arms of God. So let the storms rage high, the dark clouds rise, they won't worry me, for I'm sheltered safe within the arms of God. He walks with me, and naught of earth shall harm me, for I'm sheltered in the arms of God. Yes, I'm sheltered in the arms of God. Arms of God, arms of God. Arms of God, 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 arms of God,
and abode, a city with foundations firm as the eternal throne, nor wars nor desolations shall ever move a stone. O Zion, Zion, I long thy gates to see. O Zion, Zion, when shall I dwell in thee? No night is there, no sorrow, no death and no decay, no yesterday, no morrow, but one eternal day. O Zion, Zion, I long thy gates to see. O Zion, Zion, when shall I dwell in thee? Within its pearly portals, angelic armies sing, with glorified immortals, the praises of its King. O Zion, Zion, I long thy gates to see. O Zion, Zion, when shall I dwell in thee? Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Lord, lift up your name with hearts full of praise. So be exalted, O Lord my God. Hosanna in the highest. Worthy, worthy, worthy is the King of kings. Worthy, you are worthy. Worthy is the King of kings. Lord, lift up your name with hearts full of praise. So be exalted, O Lord my God. Hosanna in the highest. We are standing on holy ground, and I know that there are angels all around. Let us praise Jesus. us now. We are standing in.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And for those who are with us here in the building, for those that are at home with us as well. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 here in just a few moments. I've got to just wrap up a little bit on the conversation about the head covering there in the first part of the chapter. Just one last thought in relationship to that we didn't quite get to last Wednesday night. And then once we cover that, then we'll come back to the text and talk a little bit about then this secondary issue in 1 Corinthians 11 where he says, I'm not going to praise you on. And their attitudes and work towards the Lord's Supper needed some adjustments, for lack of a better description. And so that's how the chapter will wrap up here this evening in our study. But before we begin, if you would bow your heads with me, let's have a word of prayer together this evening. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this a beautiful day you've provided for us, an opportunity now at the close of the day to study from your word, to appreciate your message. We are thankful for the understanding that we can gain from the testimony that you provide for us. Strengthen us in this effort. Help us to make applications and learn from your word, and let it guide us and strengthen us every day. And we pray all this through Christ's name. Amen. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this phrase here in verse 16, where he's been through this discourse, right? And he talked first about relationships, that man was over woman, but who was over man? Christ. And who was over him? God the Father, right? And so there was this relationship pattern, if you will, that he describes. And the basic point is that you want to be respectful of those relationships. And the kind of the imagery is, why would a woman praying or prophesying? We've talked about my conviction is that's spiritual gifts we're dealing with there in that text. And so if she's going to use those spiritual gifts, then she needed to have a covering. And the reason for that was, in that culture, that was the way a woman would show what? Right, her relationship to a man, and in particular whom? Her husband, right? It was the cultural way for her to demonstrate that. And if she took liberties to walk and step away from that custom, tradition, ordinance, culture, whichever word you want to use, then that could maybe give a false impression about whether or not she respected this relationship as she should. And so he has this conversation about her need to wear a covering, and the man shouldn't wear a covering. And we talked about the fact that in some senses, if he wore it, who's he covering up? He's covering up Jesus, right? Guys, that's who was described as being above him. If she's covering up man, who should be covered up, right? Because Jesus is the focus. So that imagery works a little bit in the conversation as well. So we had our discussion as it relates to those matters over the last 2 weeks, actually, the last 2 Wednesdays. But we came down to this point. There were 2 basic points here at the latter end of this context. One was that he spoke about the woman's hair being what? Long. And he said, it doesn't even nature tell you that a man should have shorter hair and a woman should have longer hair. And by the way, generally speaking, it kind of grows that way, right? You know, typically speaking, now there's exceptions to that. But basically his point is that you can just understand this principle without a bunch of laws and strict, just doesn't nature itself tell you that that's the approach? Doesn't culture tell you that's the approach? But it does make that comment about a woman's hair being for her a covering. Thoughts about that? Give you a chance before I... What do you think he means? Well, the conversation is about when women are praying and prophesying, right? That's the context. But if his point is then his point is they should wear a covering when they do that. They should have a covering when they do that. And then he makes the arguments as to why. And part of the argumentation of the why is custom, culture, and at the end of the context, potentially, that her hair is also intended to be grown long as a covering. And so Paul's statements and arguments, if you will, to try to help them understand the issue is pointing to all kinds of various things to help them understand why his conclusion is she should wear it. And that's the bottom line. But again, I still contend that the context of thought in that passage is when she's praying or prophesying with spiritual gifts in mind. Otherwise, it doesn't have the same weight or power. And that's just the conclusion I've drawn over the years as it relates to studying that text. Questions or comments up to that point? Now I'm going to talk about verse 16 before we're done here. So his final statement about that issue then is, if any man seem to be contentious, we have no what? We have no such custom, neither the churches of God. Now here's the challenge, right? What's the challenge of the text? Which side is the contention coming from? Right. So Paul's statement is, if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom. But he just spent 15 verses saying they had a what? They had a custom. So my argument would be, when Paul says that, he's not saying there's no head covering custom. What he's saying is there's no custom about not wearing it. When people were praying and prophesying in that particular culture and time, when she wore a covering in order to demonstrate her understanding of her relationship to man. You got to understand the big picture. You can't pull it out of the moment in which it's said and make it. So what I'm simply saying is, Paul basically, I believe he's making the argument here in verse 16 that there's no custom among the apostles or all the other churches of the day for her, when she's praying or prophesying, to not wear a covering. So don't be contentious over this. Nobody else is being contentious over. That's kind of his point. Nobody else is being contentious over this. All the other churches don't seem to have why do you guys have a problem with this in Corinth? The custom should be easy to understand. Nature should be easy to understand. The ability to understand the relationships one to another should be clear. All the information points to you being able to draw the right conclusions. And some folks may feel like they have to argue away from that if people are sitting in the building without a covering. I don't feel that's necessary, because one last time, I'll make the statement, I believe we're dealing with a time where women were prophesying and praying in the Spirit. And we don't have that today. That's gone. And so the same situation doesn't apply. Publicly. Well, in the Spirit at all. With miraculous spiritual gifts, it doesn't happen at all. Nobody. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, yes. Yeah, because there wouldn't be much other reason to prophesy. If you know what I mean, there wouldn't be much reason to have a private prophecy. So I think he's dealing with just the very nature of that, the way he ties them together. It's a public issue. I think yes. I think that's exactly what he's saying. There's division. There's all kinds of division in Corinth. That's all he's done is address division in Corinth. And he's going to talk about more division here beginning in verse 17. That's the whole letter in many senses has been about their divisiveness among them. Apparently they're fighting in Corinth over when women are praying and prophesying, do they need to wear a covering or not? Now, I believe Paul says if they're in the public praying and prophesying, based on the prophet, what the prophet Joel said was going to happen, what we see in Acts is going to happen, what we see the evangelist Philip with his 4 daughters was happening in that day, then here's the custom, here's the ordinance, here's the tradition that all the apostles and all the other churches that have been established is using. It should answer it. Right. Let's not be contentious over this, because all the evidence points to what you should be doing under that circumstance. And that's why I don't insist on that sitting here tonight for women to put a covering on, because the same circumstance does not exist today that did in that day. Questions, thoughts? And the only reason I bring that up, by the way, that way is because I've probably been guilty in the past sometimes of coming to this verse and almost acting like verse 16 just erased everything Paul said in first 15 verses. We don't have any customs, right? We don't have any customs, so I just wasted my breath for 15 verses. He didn't write that way, but, right? So I don't think that's the conclusion we can draw out of verse 16. That Paul's just basically saying, well, there aren't really any customs about this, so let's just move on and quit being contentious. Then why? That should have been verse 1, and we should have been on to the next topic, if that was the case. If the easy answer was, there aren't any customs that you need to be following, don't be divisive, and move on, I contend that would have been verse 1, and we would have been on it. But he made an argument for 15 verses. And therefore, that's why I've concluded in my study that he's basically saying, we don't have any custom for her not. We have custom for her too in this setting, among all the apostles, among all the churches. And that should be enough of a precedent for those in Corinth to follow the same pattern. I think that's the argument Paul makes. All right. But there is a problem in Corinth. And his earlier statement about was his praising of them as it relates to some of those things in the beginning of this chapter. And now he talks about something that he's not going to praise them about. So he says, now in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not, that you come together not for the better, but for the worse. Now I want you to think about that. When he says that word come together, what do you think he's talking about? Worship. Okay, I think we could easily argue that here as we see the context unfold before. So when you come together to worship, what should be the end result? It should be good, right? When you come together to worship, the end result of any worship to God should always be good. But they were coming together and leaving in worse shape than they had been when they got there. Now, it's amazing when you think about, right? And we're giving away free watches here at church. And so just throw it out there, right? I'm sorry. I mean, it would distract me the entire time if I die. But anyway, so her watch fell on the floor, and I was just being curious and picking it up and had to tease her a little bit while I did it. So that's sad to think that they have come together for worship and they're leaving worse. Now, some people may claim that, and it may be on whom? Yeah, it may be on themselves, right? Some people may come to worship. They came with wrong attitude, wrong disposition, wrong behaviors, wrong choice. They can bring all and they almost want to say, well, that was terrible, or I didn't get anything out of that, and leave upset about it. That's possible. What's happening in their circumstance is this: their behaviors, once they get there, have created an environment where they're not even really worshiping. And at the end of the result, they would have been better off not to even have come together. That's the point the Apostle Paul makes. When you've come together for worship, you ought to leave in a better circumstance than you came. But every time you do, you guys are coming and leaving worse off than you came. Well, what's the problem, Paul? What's going on that's causing all that to happen? Well, first of all, Paul says, verse 18, when you come together in the church, there's our context of worship, I believe, I hear that there be divisions among you, and I partly believe it. Let's stop there for a minute. Now, we know that's true because he's already addressed it, right? Early in the letter, some say I'm of Apollos, some say I'm of Cephas, some say I am of Paul. He's already dealt with contentious, divisive people behaving badly throughout this letter. He's come back to that thought. But in particular, there's a problem. When they're coming together, supposedly coming together for worship, but they're coming together apparently in what? In cliques or pods, or I'm sorry, I got pods on the brain, but I'll explain that to you later if you want to know why. But or groups, little pockets, right? Yeah. So Paul says that's a problem. Because when the church comes together, the church ought to come together. They ought to be one. They ought to be come together as a whole. That's absolutely right, Danny. That God's not happy with the church at Corinth for coming together in such a manner. And to come together in factious pockets and divisive mindsets is not at all what God would want or desire, and it's hindering genuine worship from them. I think it was, I may be quoting the wrong preacher, and I'm tapping the back of my head hoping it'll come from back there to the front. But I believe it was Weldon Warnick. And he was going to hold a meeting at a place where there was some pretty heavy divisiveness among the people. And he said it was noticeable because when you went in, one group was sitting over here together, small building, but one group was sitting over here in a group together. Another group was sitting over here together. Over on his side, they had one coal stove, and on this side of the room, they had another coal stove, and they had their coal pile, and this group side had their coal pile. And Weldon started, I believe it may have been Connie Adams. Anyway, I guess it's irrelevant to who the preacher was. But he started by this statement. He said, one Lord, one faith, one church, two coal piles. What's wrong with that, right? Your brethren are supposed to be one, and you can't even get along over one coal pile, let alone much more important matters. They've got issues in Corinth. When they're coming together, they're not coming together as one. Last night, I was talking to a fella, and he paid us, and when us churches of Christ that he's familiar with, and that's not his background. But he paid us a pretty high compliment. Now, you're always reserved a little bit, because you recognize our own imperfections sometimes. But he made this statement. He said, "What I always have liked about you all is your family approach to things." He viewed churches of Christ as being more connected than other groups in his perception. Now, I'll accept the compliment. That doesn't mean we've got areas to work on, right? That doesn't mean we can't improve. But I appreciated that it was something he visibly noticed. When he looked into various religious organizations, it was one of the distinct differences that he noticed. That in many other religious bodies, it was people came and they went. They came and they went. They came and they went. And there wasn't a whole lot of connectivity among people. And I think in particular he meant not just within one particular local group, but how we stayed independent yet connected to other groups as well. That we would go visit another church, and we would go speak and know people from other churches, and there was that familial kind of relationship. And it was visible enough to him that he noticed it and spoke to me about it a little bit in a conversation that was completely unrelated to that initially. And I appreciated that. But doesn't mean we don't have to be careful, though, that we can't kind of get in the same mold. Corinth had a major problem, and that is when they were coming together, they weren't coming together. There was divisions, and Paul basically says, I'm pretty much convinced it's true. Though he may not have any direct evidence of that. It may have been a while since he's been there. He hadn't seen it himself necessarily. But he's pretty convinced it's true. For there must be also heresies. Now, we generally, when we see the word heresies, we generally think of what? Okay, that might be a better translation in some ways with this word. Because generally when we think of the word heresy, we think of more of a doctrine, a teaching. That's a heresy. But heresies are really, particularly in this word here, it's a faction. So Paul's saying there's obviously factions among you. And that in some ways is happening in such a way that it's allowing for those who are really trying to serve the Lord to what? Yeah, be recognized for that. There must be also factions, heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. I could be mistaken. That's a little bit of a tricky statement in the midst of this context. But it almost seems to me that Paul says, if you find yourself being divisive among the group there in Corinth, or if you feel like you're part of this pocket over here or this pocket over there, maybe who you need to look to are the people who are trying to pull that group together. They're coming to the surface if you'll look for them. Go look for the people that are trying to pull you together rather than just join one of the pods of factions that are among the church there in Corinth. How about listening to those who are trying to pull folks together and find ways to resolve conflict and difficulty rather than having 18 coal piles because we can't even get along over how much coal to put in a coal stove? Yes, I'm listening. Yeah, those who are genuinely striving to be the body of believers. Any other thoughts or questions? I'll pause for a second. Verse 20. So when you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. I don't believe Paul's saying there, King James language is a little bit tricky. I don't believe Paul was saying that wasn't their intent. Okay? Their intent, if you will, may have been to come together to partake of the Lord's Supper. But what Paul was saying is, that's not what's happening. You may be convinced that your purpose of gathering is to come together to partake of the Lord's Supper, but that's really not what's happening. Instead, for in eating everyone taketh before others his own supper. And one is hungry, and another one's what? Pretty interesting assembly, isn't it? Now, we're going to assume that this gathering's happening when? On the Lord's Day. When they're supposed to come together to break bread and to remember the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And their intent is to come and fulfill that command doctrine, but instead, the result of their coming together is, number one, they're not coming together. They're pocketed into divisions. And secondly, you're not even really partaking of the Lord's Supper. Look over there, and that guy's got a whole, basket full of pheasant. I don't know what they're eating, but over here is another group that's and then over here's a guy. What? He's drunk. And Paul says we're worshiping God. Now, by the way, I'm not excusing them, but where did they get that from? Say it again, Ken. That's exactly right. they came out of this. Corinth is riddled with paganism. Remember, they've already had these issues with what do I do about all these temples where the meat, the animals are being sacrificed, and then the meat ends up at the marketplace, and do I need to ask the butcher whether or not that came from that temple over there before I can consume it? And right, so they've come out of this really paganistic, and so in many ways they're behaving and making decisions and choices that they would have made under those same variables, religious practices that they came out of. Now, Paul doesn't excuse it, and he's going to challenge them to improve. But in some ways, it's understandable. One of the lessons I like to accept and use in application out of that text is this. You don't quit everything you've ever been overnight. Right? You don't just now, you might find one little something that you're able to try to, but I'm talking about you don't turn an entire lifestyle, you don't turn an entire practice of life over in a moment. And the church is very young, right? Church is in its infancy. New Testament isn't even what? It's not even finished. They're just getting snippets, if you will, as the apostles may be able to arrive, particularly Paul, or send somebody, or somebody gets. So your church is young, information is limited. You're given these commands about come together and honor Jesus' sacrifice, and you may know the narrative, but am I allowed to bring in my other practices from these other things that I used to do? And so you can kind of see it, right? And I'm, again, not trying to make excuses for them. I'm just trying to get us to understand how could this be? Because this is completely foreign to us, right? We wouldn't, it would look very odd for that to happen today. It wasn't odd in Corinth because that's what they came from. And maybe a side lesson is for us is that sometimes we need to be prepared of how we handle someone who comes out of a different background and is going to need time to learn and make adjustments. And we've got to find ways to teach and educate. And that's what Paul's doing. He's saying, I can praise you on some things in Corinth, but there's some things I can't praise you about, and this is one of them that's got me concerned. And let's talk about this. When you come together, don't come together in divisive ways. And when you come together, even if you believe it's for the intent of partaking of the Lord's Supper, here's the reality. You've got these pockets of parties going on. One area's got a big old party going on, and then over here's a guy that's probably poor, and he's got what? He's got nothing. Don't you think about that? I mean, envision that, if you will, for a moment. You come to assemble with the church at Corinth, and over here, you got a group, and it looks like Thanksgiving dinner, and over here's a guy, and he's got nothing, but because you're not part of our pocket, you stay hungry while we feast. That's not the Lord's church. That's not the way the body functions and works. And we've got to learn that, though the practical details might be different for us. The same kind of thing can happen where we kind of stay in our little segments and we're contented with that. And it can lead to an impression, even if it wasn't the intent. It can leave an impression that we didn't come together, that 6 or 7 different groups came together in the same location. That's what we have to avoid. That's what Corinth needed to learn. And they have a very specific issue going on as it relates to that. Questions, thoughts, comments? Fire away. I'll pause for a minute.
They're trying to put both pagan world and the church
Yeah.
in the same thing.
Yeah. They're just borrowing. And we've got illustration, right? When the Israelites came out of Egypt, Moses is going longer than they wanted him to be. They're convinced he's not coming back, and what they do? And build golden calf. Why? Because that's what the Egyptians would have done. They'd have fashioned some kind of figure that they were common to their religious practices, and they'd start worshiping it. You kind of go back to what you're used to and what's common to you. And changing behaviors isn't always easy, but it's going to have to change if the church in Corinth is going to be what it needs to be. And by the way, to my knowledge, I have to go back and look, but it's interesting. We talk about these biblical churches, and some of these locations still exist in our world, but the churches don't. It's just kind of fascinating when you think about how time has eroded certain things away. But anyway, church at Corinth has got issues. So, verse 22 then, he starts a series of questions. What? Have you not houses to eat and to drink in? Or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. Is Paul condemning the consumption of food inside the walls of a structure that is used for worship? Is that what he's trying to say? So before you say yes, throw all the mints, gum, candy, and everything up my way. I want it all. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And that's what I'm putting. Now, I'm not arguing that this is so narrow that it has no application. That's not the point I'm trying to make. What I'm saying is Paul is not dealing with a momentary consumption of some type of food inside a structure. What Paul was dealing with is when they had turned their worship services into feasts and parties and gatherings of social purpose rather than coming together for the spiritual function of the church, which was to partake of the Lord's Supper as designed and outlined, which he's going to quote here in a minute as it relates to the Lord's Supper. The context that's the context. When he says, "What do you not have? Do you not have another place to do all those things in?" That's what he's saying. Go ahead, Amy. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And here's the are preachers allowed to play devil's advocate? That sounds horrible. But I'm trying to get you to think for a minute. Where was the church building for the church at Corinth located? Okay. Well, we don't really know. We know that some are meeting, but my point is this. Church-owned structures was foreign to that time period. So he can't be talking about the consumption of a food, whatever it might be, inside a church-owned structure because they didn't have that when he said it. What he's saying is when the church gathers for the purpose of worship, that's what it needs to be gathered for. And the church, its focus and purpose. Now, I'll throw it out there. We're almost done at least for the folks on the camera for a minute, and lest I leave them guessing. The church has what kind of purpose and focus? Spiritual. That's why there wasn't coffee and donuts and chips or soda or whatever you wanted when you came in the building tonight. It's not about the non-permission to consume inside these walls. It's about the purpose of the church isn't social. The purpose of the church, when it comes together, is spiritual, and that's the difference. Now, maybe that's the way I feel stronger making that argument, if you will, than I do just a blanket you can't consume. Because if you can't consume, that means you can't consume anything. It's all in, right? And we just have to. And why we don't is maybe different than the way we think. And why we don't is because that's not the role and purpose of the church. And in that sense, I would argue, don't you have houses to take care of those things that are not the focus and spiritual work of the church? Don't you have some other place that you can handle those kinds of things? That's what Paul's asking. Let the church be a spiritual gathering. You want to have a social event, go have a social event. That's kind of what he's saying. And so I'm just trying to encourage us to maybe make a more solid argument, lest we get caught in a trap as it relates to it.
A lot of the churches at that time were in people's homes.
Yeah. So they're going to meet in people's homes, which happened with the Apostle Paul. On other occasions, they're going to be meeting in some down by the river. If you're in Jerusalem, you might meet in Solomon's porch. And so you're going to, wherever you could find a place for people to gather, you're going to gather. I'm not. Make sure you hear me clearly. I'm not advocating in any stretch of the imagination that we open up the idea of turning anything into a social gathering inside these walls. That's not my intent. My intent is just to simply illustrate to us, let's make the right argument, if you will. Let's draw from the right principles, not just say you can't consume food inside these walls. That's too broad and doesn't necessarily have the weight of Scripture behind it. Let's make a better statement of, we use this structure for the spiritual purposes that God has given us, and we restrict it to those spiritual purposes, and we try to encourage folks in their homes to be hospitable and to offer opportunities to do all those other social things that, by the way, help families. They help congregations get to, I don't argue against that. It helps congregations get closer when they spend more time out, not just in worship, but outside. I believe in that. But Paul makes a simple distinction here. And in particular, when they're coming together on the Lord's Day, let's keep the focus where it belongs, because that's really the heart of his argument, by the way. Is when you've come together on the Lord's Day, let's stay focused. And let's be careful. Thank you for all those at home for joining us tonight. We'll come back to this text and finish up his discussion. For those in the building, I'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes here to chime in with other questions or thoughts. But for those at home, we'll see you, Lord willing, on Sunday at 10 o'clock.
Holy Word.